Daring, divisive, Doom. Summing up the history of the Doom franchise as an evolution is not completely true. For instance, 1993's Doom roots its concerns in close quarters combat. Battles were often brief, but punished sloppy movement. But to break the inevitable tedium, the player will occasionally run into fights that are larger in scale and more hectic. But on the contrary, 1994's Doom 2 is more infatuated with the latter half of Doom 1's flow of gameplay. An almost complete 180 from its predecessor, Doom 2 is more comfortable with arenas and large battles. For players seeking greater doses of killing, Doom's second entry will likely satisfy. While both games look very similar from an outsider's perspective, these two have very different philosophies for their flow of gameplay. Doom 2 would serve as the stepping stone for the innovative mindset of its sequels. But before someone in the comments mentions the final Doom series, I don't consider either of those to properly hold the status of an id Software title. TNT Evolution and the Plutonia experiment weren't created in-house, with the former being bought for the final Doom project at the last moment, and the latter being presented to id as a set of incomplete maps, also to be bought out for Final Doom. Final Doom is more of a fan compilation than anything else. From the third game forward, the franchise would mostly leave the classic Doom era behind. 2004's Doom 3 is an action-oriented survival horror, featuring notably slower gameplay and a world filled to the brim with dark locales. The 2016 reboot and its sequel Doom Eternal, while heavily inspired by the classic era, are both hardcore arcade-style adventures rooted in complex arenas and light RPG elements. This is where things get messy within the Doom community. Each Doom entry, even the first, has its camp of firm believers. Some think the original loses too much steam, while others find games like 3 in the reboot series to completely miss the point of the classic era. But there's one title that seems almost immune to criticism. Within the cracks and crevices, a compromise between Doom 1 and 2 lies. Some call it the real Doom 3, I call it Doom Realized. Welcome to the world of Doom 64. After 2 triumphant battles in hell between Doom 1 and 2, the Union Aerospace Corporation, a multiplanetary conglomerate, nukes Mars' moons Phobos and Deimos, the source of the Hell invasions, in hopes to kill any demonic stragglers. One demon was able to survive the nukes and hide within the radiation signals, the Mother Demon. And wouldn't you know it, the Mother Demon has the ability to resurrect Hellspawn. Having the most experience with fighting Hell, our protagonist Doom Guy is commissioned by the military to take care of the problem. As with all Doom narratives, Doom 64 is just looking to give the player a reason to kill more demons, to which I will never object. But this wasn't just some throwaway sequel. Doom 64 was a collaboration between Midway Games and id Software. The project was not made in-house, but overseen by id Software from the ground up. While Final Doom's 2 games were noticed by id, Doom 64 was supervised by id. Midway had creative freedom within the limitations and standards of id Software, making 64 the most Doom an out-of-house Doom game could be. And yet, Midway Games didn't settle for just more of the same. The gameplay at its rawest may remain identical to games before, but Doom 64 did its homework. Seasoned Doom fans will likely notice that Doom 64 faces some limitations. A shorter campaign, notably limited range of monster sound effects. I suggest brace up for hearing the zombie man roar a lot. Missing monsters, specifically the Chain Gunner, Revenant, Spider Mastermind, and Archvile, and most remarkably, smaller maps. But this doesn't stop the game from making the most out of the franchise's bare essentials. 64's level design generally favors Doom 1's tighter approach. But unlike the original, which is fairly forgiving and often puts the player on compensatory grounds for engaging the enemy, Doom 64 likes to drop players on an uphill battle. There are several encounters that have rather strict limitations on where Doom Guy can move, or at the very least, what targets he can immediately choose. Doom 64 isn't very big on giving the player a lot of cover or immediate areas of retreat, reinforced by the game's preference of tight rooms. Enemies also aren't quite as persistent as they were in previous Doom titles, and to the best of my knowledge they rarely, if ever, open doors. So trying to lure everything into one spot isn't as dependable. Fitting into 64's already demanding caliber is Doom 2's penchant for hectic gauntlets. Suspiciously empty rooms and easy to get item pickups are often a sign of an upcoming barrage of enemies. Most ambushes are no exception to 64's claustrophobic nature, and I found myself being countlessly ground to a bloody mist. Even in more open areas, Doom 64 is able to maintain its oppressive design. Larger combat scenarios often follow what I like to call the Dead Simple rule. For those unaware, Dead Simple is an infamous map in Doom 2 that has the player pitted against several mancubi. The mancubi are spread out from each other, so rounding them up or attempting to circle strafe them aren't reliable strategies. Prioritizing is key to victory in this battle. 64 reinterprets this layout to various degrees, but the core principles are quite similar. The player is confronted by several, usually fodder-class enemies around the center of the scenario. Lurking on the edges are enemies heavier in class, which constantly harass the player with projectiles. These enemies hanging on the quote outskirts are best dealt with last, as they often require more focus to take down. Just as Dead Simple spreads out its enemies to force the player to strategize, so does a handful of battles in Doom 64. What really helps these Doom 2 inspired battles better stand out are the small adjustments made to justify the utility of lesser guns. Doom 2 had a notable problem with its level design favoring the super shotgun, rocket launcher, and BFG 9000, or as we'll call them, the Big Three. The game was obsessed with chucking several enemies at the player, and while other guns like the chain gun or plasma rifle weren't at all useless, they mostly paled in comparison to the Big Three. The shotgun had it the worst in Doom 2. Calling its effort against a wave of enemies a struggle is too generous. With its inability to keep up with clusters of foes, it was reduced to being a tool to pick off stragglers. Doom 64 discourages, and even in some cases punishes, crushing on stronger weapons. The super shotgun and the rocket launcher both have heavy recoil that pushes the player backwards when fired. This isn't very noticeable when fighting on flat grounds, but when fighting on tight platforms, the recoil can ensure an early grave. When descending with enough backwards momentum, the knockback from both guns' recoil almost completely overrides the player's movement input, meaning that using either on stairs pushes back Doom Guy in a nearly perfect line. Outside of the Doom 2-esque battles, Doom 64 prefers to space enemy placements further out, which gives lesser guns, the shotgun in particular, more screen time. Grunt enemies are quicker to harass the player, with the Lost Souls being the most notably changed, having a much shorter grace period between charges at Doom Guy, making them go from being simple nuisances to one of the most dangerous enemies in the game. The shotgun or its super counterpart can take out one or two with ease, but any more than a pair of Lost Souls warrants using the chain gun or plasma rifle, as other guns are just too slow to keep up and won't cause as much enemy flinching. Because of how dangerous Lost Souls have become, the Pain Elemental, an enemy that can spawn Lost Souls, becomes an even bigger threat, especially since it rapidly spawns 2 at a time, further justifying the use of faster guns. This more balanced blend of guns versus utility is what makes the open-ended arenas feel unique. The Big Three are no longer the rule, but the exception. I recommend playing this game on its hardest difficulty, Watch Me Die. The Doom 1 and 2 aspects of 64 shine at their brightest when they aren't holding back on the player. On Watch Me Die, enemies hit much harder and stronger enemies show up frequently, making challenging battles more adrenaline-fueled and satisfying to overcome. Complementing Doom 64's combat is the feedback from Doom Guy's arsenal. Despite both shotguns taking a hit with their animations, with the super shotgun suffering a much greater loss, neither are unsatisfying to use. Along with the rest of the weapon roster, the shotguns have an aggressive weight to their sound effects, especially with regards to their predecessors. Let's compare. Adding even more weight is the visual recoil that comes with non-energy guns. Excluding the pistol, the shotguns, chain gun, and rocket launcher all slightly flick the camera upwards with every shot. This visual feedback reassures the tough and man-made feel of these 4 guns, which makes every firefight so much more engaging. This greatly contrasts with the recoil-lacking energy weapons, which generally look cleaner, less rusted, and less used, save for the Unmaker, a weapon clearly made with the crude resources of hell. The missing visual feedback plays into the energy weapon's more sophisticated demeanor, making them an enjoyable contrast to their hand-me-down counterparts. But all this talk about gameplay ties back to the combat. When exploration is involved, Doom 64 even creates a solution for a pestering issue. A big problem with both Doom 1 and 2, especially the first one, is excessive key and switch hunting. While I may not have this problem anymore, my early playthroughs of the original duology were plagued with me getting lost a lot. Certain levels, like Doom 2's Industrial Zone and the Chasm, or most levels in Doom 1's third episode, Inferno, get too ambitious with their level design and have the player running around snooping for a key or switch they happen to gloss over. Yet, throughout these fresh playthroughs of Doom 64, I noticed that I rarely got lost. This is because levels rubber band the player back to a familiar location. When playing the game again and reviewing footage, I noticed that as I played through levels, I usually ended up circling back to where I came from, either through backtracking or more commonly through the level leading me back to a designated location. Doom 64 builds its levels around hub-like locations, which represent the progress the player has made. These hubs are also usually one of the first things the player sees in a level. Hubs often tease players, whether it be a blocked location, a switch just out of reach, or a locked door requiring a key. When the player hits milestones within a level, such as finding a switch or key, returning to the hub area to progress is going to be instinctive. On levels that don't focus as much on hub locations, Doom 64 likes to use monsters as a guide for what has changed. One of my favorite examples of this is level 21, which has the player hitting a switch that causes the ground to shake. The player has nothing to infer from this alone, but once they step out of the room, a Baron of Hell is residing by the teleporter that the player came from earlier, hinting that there are clues beyond that Baron. Doom 64 is good at fitting the amount of factors in the player's deductive reasoning, making it harder to get lost. The game's aesthetic plays a part in this improved navigation as well. The trivial aspect of the visuals is that they're gorgeous, having a diverse range of lighting, colors, and even level formations to complement areas like temples, construction sites, torture chambers, caves, and more. But the utilitarian aspect of the aesthetic helps areas within a level stand out more from the rest. Not that either game was lazily slapped together, but Doom 1 and 2 usually don't change much in aesthetic in a single level. Whereas in Doom 64, players can more easily understand where they are by looking at things like the color scheme, the lighting of the room, and what the room even is, such as a library. Even with Doom 64's bonus second episode, The Lost Levels, which I find to be not nearly as well designed as the main game, Night Dive Studios was able to use at least a little of the first episode's aesthetic tricks to make Lost Levels easier to explore. I know that for this entire video, I've done nothing but almost completely praise Doom 64, but it's in my opinion that this game just doesn't stumble nearly as much as its predecessors does. 64 can occasionally be unfair in difficulty or briefly fall into bad level design traps done before, but id and Midway clearly worked hard at ironing out the shortcomings of classic Doom. As for the missing monsters, the only one that I really miss is the Revenant because it deserves more love. The rest of them are either incredibly annoying or forgettable. It's interesting that a game as small as it is was able to address so many issues and even expand upon the positives of its two big brothers. Doom 64 certainly proves that a game doesn't have to be bigger to be badder, and perhaps the best sign of 64's quality was when I went back to capture footage of the first two games, and I couldn't help but say, dang.